Have you ever been in a room where everyone thinks you're invisible? Where your voice doesn't matter? Where your presence is barely acknowledged? Where you're just part of the furniture? That was my entire existence until the day I screamed those 4 words that changed everything. Don't close that casket. I'm Maria, and what I'm about to tell you is the most terrifying, heart-pounding, absolutely insane experience of my life. The kind of story that makes you question everything you think you know about truth, power, and the value of a human life. And I'm telling you right now, if you've ever felt small, if you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, if you've ever wondered whether speaking up is worth the risk, you need to hear this. Because what happened in that funeral home on that gray Tuesday morning didn't just save a life. It shattered mine into 1,000 pieces and forced me to rebuild myself from scratch. My hands are still shaking as I write this, months later, because the weight of what I witnessed, what I discovered, what I had to fight against, it never really leaves you. It becomes part of your DNA, woven into every breath you take. So let me take you back to that moment. Let me help you understand how a 62-year-old cleaning woman with arthritic knees and a face full of wrinkles became the center of the most explosive scandal our city had ever seen. Let me show you what happens when the invisible become visible, when the voiceless find their scream, when everything you thought was solid ground turns out to be quicksand beneath your feet. My story doesn't begin in that funeral home, though. It begins in the shadows, in the corners, in the spaces between the important people and their important lives. I've been a cleaner for 43 years. 43 years of scrubbing floors that other people walk on without thinking. 43 years of emptying trash cans filled with the discarded moments of lives I'll never live. 43 years of being the ghost in the room, the person you don't really see, even when you're looking right at me. I've cleaned hospitals where babies were born and old men died. I've cleaned office buildings where million-dollar deals were made over coffee I prepared but wasn't allowed to drink. I've cleaned funeral homes where families said their final goodbyes to people I'd never meet, never know, never mourn. And in all those years, in all those places, I learned something that most people never understand. When you're invisible, you see everything. People don't guard their words around you. They don't hide their emotions. They don't pretend to be something they're not because they don't think you're really there. You become a witness to humanity in its rawest, most unfiltered form. You see the businessman cry in the bathroom stall. You hear the doctor admit she doesn't know what's wrong. You watch the grieving widow smile at her phone while texting someone who definitely isn't her dead husband. You see it all, and nobody knows you're seeing it. And that knowledge becomes this heavy thing you carry around, this burden of truth that nobody wants to hear because nobody thinks you matter enough to listen to. I started working at Serenity Funeral Home when I was 58 years old. My previous job at the hospital had ended when they decided to outsource the cleaning services to a company that hired younger workers for less money. I was devastated, honestly. That hospital had been my second home for 26 years. I knew every hallway, every supply closet, every nurse by name. And then one day, just like that, I was told my services were no longer needed. Thank you for your years of dedication. Here's 2 weeks severance. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. I cried for 3 days straight. Not because I loved scrubbing hospital floors, but because I felt erased, deleted, removed from the only purpose I'd known for most of my adult life. My daughter Rosa tried to comfort me, telling me it was a blessing in disguise, that I could finally retire, travel, enjoy life. But how do you enjoy life when you've spent 40 years defining yourself by your work? When your identity is so wrapped up in being useful that being useless feels like dying? I couldn't sit still. I couldn't watch daytime television. I couldn't pretend to be happy about having free time when free time just felt like falling into an abyss of irrelevance. So I found the job at Serenity Funeral Home 3 weeks later, and I grabbed it like a lifeline, even though the pay was worse and the hours were longer, and the work was, frankly, more depressing than anything I'd done before. Cleaning a funeral home is different from cleaning anywhere else. There's a weight to it, a solemnity that seeps into your bones. You're not just wiping down surfaces. You're preparing sacred spaces for people's final goodbyes. You're making sure the viewing rooms smell like flowers instead of formaldehyde. You're polishing the pews where mothers will collapse in grief. You're vacuuming the carpets that will absorb the tears of children who don't understand why grandpa won't wake up. It's heavy work emotionally, but I found a strange peace in it. Maybe because I'd reached an age where death didn't scare me anymore, where it felt more like an old friend waiting patiently in the corner rather than a monster under the bed. Or maybe because there was something honest about a funeral home. People came here to face truth, to acknowledge endings, to stop pretending that life goes on forever. There was less pretense here than in the hospital, where everyone fought so hard against the inevitable. Here, the inevitable had already won, and there was a strange relief in that surrender. I got to know the funeral directors, Mr. Peterson and his son James. They were kind to me, which was more than I could say for most of my previous employers. They remembered my name, asked about my daughter, gave me a Christmas bonus that first year that made me cry in the supply closet. They treated me like a person, not just a pair of hands with a mop, and I worked hard for them, harder than I probably should have at my age, because I wanted to prove that hiring me wasn't a mistake, that old hands could still do good work, that experience mattered even in something as simple as cleaning. The millionaire's name was Richard Calloway, though I didn't know that when I first heard about the funeral. All I knew was that it was going to be the biggest service Serenity had ever hosted. Mr. E.A. Peterson was nervous for weeks leading up to it, constantly checking and rechecking every detail. The Calloway family was important, he kept saying. Old money, the kind that built libraries and had wings of hospitals named after them. Richard Calloway had died suddenly at 68, a massive heart attack while playing golf at his country club, and the funeral was expected to draw hundreds of mourners, including the mayor, several state representatives, and more wealthy people than our small funeral home typically saw in a year. Mr. Peterson hired extra staff, brought in additional flower arrangements, even had the parking lot repaved. Everything had to be perfect, he said. Everything had to reflect the importance of the man we were honoring. I understood the pressure, even if I didn't fully understand why one person's death deserved more ceremony than another's. In my experience, the dead don't care about flower arrangements or freshly paved parking lots. But the living do, I suppose. The living need these rituals, these displays, these ways of measuring how much someone mattered by how much money they spend saying goodbye. The morning of the funeral arrived cold and gray, the kind of November day that feels like the world itself is mourning. I arrived at 5 a.m., 2 hours before the service was scheduled to begin, because I wanted everything to be spotless before the first mourners arrived. The viewing room where Mr. Calloway's body lay in state was my responsibility, and I took that responsibility seriously. I'd cleaned it the night before, but I wanted to do one final check, make sure every surface gleamed, every chair was perfectly positioned, every tissue box was full. I entered the room quietly, my cleaning cart squeaking slightly on the polished floor, and I remember thinking how peaceful it looked. The casket was positioned at the front of the room, closed for now, but scheduled to be opened at 6:30 for family viewing before the public service. The flowers were extraordinary. Thousands of dollars worth of roses and lilies and orchids arranged in elaborate displays that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. The lighting was soft and warm, designed to comfort rather than illuminate too harshly. Everything was perfect, just as Mr. Peterson had wanted. I started my work at the back of the room, dusting the chairs one by one, checking under each seat for anything that might have been dropped or forgotten. I worked methodically, the way I always did, letting my mind wander to other things, to Rosa's upcoming birthday, to the leaky faucet in my kitchen that I kept meaning to fix, to whether I should buy a new winter coat or try to make my old one last another season. This was my meditation, this repetitive work, this transformation of chaos into order, this making of dirty things clean. And then I heard it, the sound that would change everything. A thump from inside the casket, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A definite thump, followed by what sounded like scratching. I froze, my dust cloth hanging limply in my hand, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I must have imagined it, I told myself. Old ears playing tricks, or maybe the building settling, or pipes knocking, or any of 1,000 rational explanations that made more sense than what my brain was trying to tell me. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, listening with every cell in my body. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. See? I told myself. You're losing it, Maria. Too many years breathing cleaning chemicals have finally pickled your brain. I forced myself to move, to continue my work, to push the impossible thought out of my mind. But my hands were shaking as I dusted, and I couldn't stop glancing at that casket. Couldn't stop straining my ears for sounds that shouldn't be there. Couldn't stop the cold dread that was creeping up my spine like ice water. I tried to focus on my work, tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous, tried to laugh at myself for being a superstitious old woman scared by nothing. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A definite thump, and then what sounded unmistakably like a muffled moan. My blood turned to ice. My legs went weak. I dropped my dust cloth and it fell to the floor in slow motion, or at least that's how it felt, because time had suddenly become this strange elastic thing that stretched and contracted in ways that didn't make sense. I stared at that casket, my breath coming in short gasps, my mind racing through possibilities that all seemed insane. Dead people don't make sounds. Dead people don't move. Dead people don't thump and scratch and moan. Unless they're not dead. Have you ever had a moment where everything you believe about reality shifts? Where the ground beneath your feet suddenly feels uncertain? That's what happened to me in that instant. Every rational thought I'd ever had was screaming at me to ignore it, to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But there was this other voice, quieter but more insistent. The voice that had kept me alive through 62 years of life. The voice that had warned me when my ex-husband was lying. That had told me to grab Rosa and run when he raised his fist. That had pushed me to apply for that hospital job when I had no experience and every reason to believe they wouldn't hire me. That voice was screaming now, screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong, and that if I walked away, if I ignored what I'd heard, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I found myself walking toward the casket, my legs moving without conscious thought, my entire body trembling with fear and adrenaline, and something else. Something that felt like destiny or purpose or maybe just pure stubborn refusal to be the person who ignored what she knew to be true. I reached the casket and pressed my ear against the polished wood, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear anything else. And then, clear as day, I heard breathing. Shallow, labored, desperate breathing. And another moan, weaker this time, but unmistakable. There was someone alive in that casket. Richard Calloway, the man who was supposed to be dead, who had been declared dead by doctors and embalmed by funeral professionals, was breathing. The next few seconds were pure chaos inside my head. Every instinct I had was warring with every other instinct. The rational part of my brain was insisting this was impossible, that I must be having a stroke or a hallucination or some kind of mental breakdown. The terrified part was screaming at me to run, to get away, to not get involved in something this insane. But there was this other part, this part that I didn't even know existed until that moment, that was absolutely certain about what I had to do. I had to open that casket. I had to see for myself. I had to help whoever was trapped inside, even if it meant looking crazy, even if it meant losing my job, even if it meant facing consequences I couldn't begin to imagine. My hands moved to the casket lid, and I realized it was locked, secured with some kind of mechanism I didn't understand. Of course it was locked. Why wouldn't it be locked? Dead people don't need to get out. The panic was rising in my throat now, threatening to choke me. I looked around wildly for something, anything that could help. My cleaning cart. I ran to it, my arthritic knees screaming in protest, and grabbed the heaviest tool I had, a metal pry bar I used for moving heavy equipment. I'd never used it for anything like this before, but desperation makes you creative. I jammed the pry bar into the seam of the casket lid and pulled with all my strength, all my weight, all the fury of 62 years of being ignored and dismissed and treated like I didn't matter. The lock gave way with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire funeral home. I dropped the pry bar and lifted the lid, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it, my breath coming in gasps, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the interior of that casket. And there he was, Richard Calloway, supposedly dead for 3 days, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, his chest rising and falling in tiny, barely perceptible movements. He was alive. Dear God, he was alive. I don't remember making the decision to scream. I don't remember forming the words. But suddenly I was running toward the door, my voice tearing out of my throat in a sound I'd never made before, a primal, desperate scream that came from somewhere deep in my soul. Don't close that casket. Someone help. He's alive. He's alive. Don't close that casket. I burst through the door into the hallway, still screaming, my words tumbling over each other in an incoherent rush. Mr. Peterson appeared from his office, his face shocked, and then James came running from the preparation room, and within seconds there were people everywhere, asking what was wrong, telling me to calm down, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. And maybe I had. Maybe I was completely insane. But I grabbed Mr. Peterson's arm with both hands, gripping him so hard I probably left bruises, and I forced him to look at me, really look at me, for the first time since I'd started working there. He's alive, I said, and my voice came out steady now, strong, absolutely certain. Richard Calloway is alive, in the casket. I heard him breathing. You have to come now. You have to help him. Please, you have to believe me. The look on Mr. Peterson's face was something I'll never forget. Confusion, disbelief, concern, and maybe a touch of pity for the crazy old cleaning lady who had finally snapped. But he came with me, probably just to humor me, probably already thinking about how gently he would fire me after dealing with whatever delusion I was having. James followed, and so did Margaret, the receptionist, and 2 other staff members whose names I didn't know. We all rushed back into the viewing room, a strange parade of skepticism and dread, and I ran straight to the casket, pointing at it like it was some kind of evidence in a trial. "Look," I said, "just look, please." Mr. Peterson approached slowly, reluctantly, like he was approaching a wild animal. He leaned over the casket, his face pinched with professional concern masking deep irritation, and then I saw it happen. I saw the exact moment when his expression changed from skepticism to shock. His eyes went wide, his mouth fell open, his hand shot to his chest like he was having a heart attack himself. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my God. James, call 911. Call 911 right now, and get Dr. Morrison on the phone. Margaret, clear the building, cancel the service, get everyone out, move." The room exploded into action. James pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Margaret ran for the front desk, staff members scattered in every direction. And I just stood there, frozen, staring at that casket, at the impossible thing inside it, at the man who was supposed to be dead but wasn't, and I felt this strange sense of unreality wash over me, like I was watching a movie of my own life rather than living it. The paramedics arrived in what felt like seconds but was probably closer to 10 minutes, their sirens screaming loud enough to wake the actual dead. They rushed in with their equipment, their efficient movements, their trained calm in the face of chaos, and they took over the scene with an authority that made everyone else seem like children playing dress-up. I stepped back, pressing myself against the wall, trying to stay out of the way while simultaneously trying to see everything that was happening. One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, checked Richard Calloway's pulse and her face went pale. She looked at her partner, an older man with a grizzled beard, and they exchanged a look that communicated volumes without a single word. "He's alive," she said, her voice tight with shock. "Barely, but he's alive. We need to transport immediately. I've never seen anything like this. How long was he in there?" Mr. Peterson couldn't seem to form words. He just stood there, opening and closing his mouth like a fish, his normally composed face crumbling into something raw and terrified. It was James who finally spoke, his voice cracking with stress. 3 days, he said. "He was pronounced dead 3 days ago. We received the body from the hospital. He was embalmed. This is impossible. This can't be happening." The bearded paramedic was already lifting Richard Calloway out of the casket, handling him with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Embalmed?" he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Are you absolutely certain he was embalmed?" James nodded miserably. "I did it myself. Standard procedure. I don't understand how—" His voice trailed off into silence, into the abyss of implications that was opening up beneath all of us. They loaded Richard Calloway onto a stretcher and wheeled him out, moving with urgent efficiency, and suddenly the room was full of other people. People who hadn't been there before, people with badges and uniforms and notebooks and cameras, police officers, detectives, someone from the coroner's office. The funeral home had transformed from a place of peaceful mourning into a crime scene, and none of us could quite process what that meant. I was pulled aside by a detective, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, who asked me to explain everything that had happened. I told her about hearing the sounds from the casket, about opening it, about finding Richard Calloway alive. She wrote everything down in a small notebook, her pen moving quickly across the page, and she asked me questions I didn't know how to answer. Why had I been in the room so early? Had I noticed anything unusual before this morning? Had anyone else been in the building? Had I touched anything besides the casket? I answered as best I could, my voice shaking, my hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles had turned white. When she was done, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been respect, or it might have been suspicion, or it might have been both. "You saved his life," she said simply. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't heard those sounds, if you hadn't acted—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both knew what she was saying. Richard Calloway would have been buried alive, would have died screaming in the darkness of his own casket, would have experienced a horror that most people couldn't even imagine. Because of me. Because of my willingness to look crazy. Because of my refusal to ignore what I knew to be true. He had a chance. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt sick. I felt confused. I felt angry, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Maybe because this shouldn't have happened. Maybe because someone, somewhere, had made a terrible mistake that had nearly resulted in an unthinkable tragedy. Maybe because I was starting to wonder if it was really a mistake at all. The funeral home was closed for the rest of the day. Yellow police tape stretched across the entrance, officers going through every room with methodical precision. Mr. Peterson and James were questioned for hours, their faces growing more haggard as time went on. The Calloway family arrived in the afternoon, a procession of expensive cars and expensive people, and the sounds of their shock and fury echoed through the building. I heard Mrs. Calloway, Richard's wife, her voice high and shrill with hysteria. "How is this possible? How could you people let this happen? We trusted you with my husband's body. What kind of operation are you running here?" I wanted to disappear. I wanted to go home, crawl into my bed, and pretend this day had never happened. But I couldn't leave. The police needed me to stay for more questions. The Calloway family wanted to meet me, to thank me, though their gratitude felt stiff and uncomfortable, like they weren't sure whether to be grateful to the cleaning lady who had saved their patriarch, or angry at the situation that had required saving in the first place. And underneath all of that, there was this growing sense of wrongness, this feeling that we were only seeing the surface of something much deeper and much darker. Have you ever felt like you've stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to see? Like you've opened a door that was meant to stay closed? That's how I felt as the day wore on and more details started to emerge. The doctors arrived in the late afternoon, a team of specialists from the hospital where Richard Calloway had been pronounced dead, and they examined the documentation, reviewed the death certificate, studied the embalming records. And their faces, let me tell you, their faces told a story before their mouths ever opened. Dr. Morrison, the cardiologist who had declared Richard Calloway dead, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. His hands were shaking as he held the paperwork, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "This is medically impossible," he said, addressing the room full of people, lawyers and police and family members and funeral home staff. I examined Mr. Calloway myself. He had no pulse, no respiration, no pupillary response. His body temperature had dropped. Every indicator confirmed death. And yet, he trailed off, spreading his hands helplessly. "And yet, here we are," finished Dr. Chen, a neurologist who had been brought in to consult. She was younger than Dr. Morrison, with a crisp professional manner that barely concealed her own confusion. "Mr. Calloway appears to have experienced what we call a Lazarus syndrome, an extremely rare phenomenon where someone who has been declared dead spontaneously returns to cardiac activity. But this is far beyond anything I've seen in the literature. The time frame is wrong. The circumstances are wrong. And the fact that he survived for 3 days with no food, no water, minimal oxygen," she shook her head slowly. "It shouldn't be possible." The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of us wanted to voice. If Richard Calloway had been declared dead when he wasn't, if he had been embalmed while still alive, if he had been sealed in a casket and left to wake up in the darkness, then someone had made an error so catastrophic it bordered on criminal. Or maybe, and this thought was what made my blood run cold, maybe it wasn't an error at all. Mrs. Calloway seemed to be thinking the same thing. She stood up from her chair, her elegant frame rigid with fury, her perfectly made-up face twisted into something ugly and dangerous. "I want answers," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "I want to know exactly what happened to my husband. I want to know who declared him dead. I want to know who was in that hospital room. I want to know who had access to him. I want names. I want timelines. I want a full investigation into whether this was an accident or—" She paused, and the word she didn't say hung in the air like a ghost. "Murder." She didn't say it, but everyone heard it anyway. Because that's what this was starting to look like, wasn't it? Not a medical miracle or a bizarre coincidence, but an attempted murder that had nearly succeeded, that would have succeeded if not for a 62-year-old cleaning lady with good ears and better instincts. The police detective who had interviewed me earlier, whose name I'd learned was Detective Sarah Reeves, stepped forward with a calm authority that seemed to settle the room slightly. "We are conducting a full investigation, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Every aspect of your husband's medical care, his time in the hospital, the death declaration, the transport to the funeral home, everything will be examined thoroughly. I understand your frustration and your fear, but I need everyone to remain calm and let us do our jobs." But calm was the last thing anyone felt. As the evening wore on and more information came to light, the situation only became more complicated, more sinister, more impossible to explain away as simple error. The hospital released Richard Calloway's medical records, and they painted a confusing picture. He had been playing golf, as reported, when he collapsed on the seventh hole. His golf partner, a longtime friend named Martin Hendricks, had called 911 immediately. The paramedics had arrived within minutes and found Richard in cardiac arrest. They had performed CPR, used a defibrillator, transported him to the hospital where a team of doctors had worked on him for 45 minutes before declaring him dead. His wife had been called, had arrived at the hospital, had identified the body, had signed the necessary paperwork. Everything had been done according to protocol. Everything had been normal. Except somewhere in that chain of normal events, something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The toxicology report came back late that night, and that's when things really started to get interesting. Richard Calloway's blood showed traces of a drug, something called tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin found in pufferfish that can cause paralysis, respiratory failure, and a death-like state that can fool even experienced medical professionals. In sufficient doses, it can slow the heart rate to almost undetectable levels, suppress breathing to the point of invisibility, and create every appearance of death while leaving the victim conscious and aware, trapped in their own unresponsive body. It's sometimes called the zombie drug, and it's been used in various cultures for centuries to create the appearance of death for religious or criminal purposes. And someone had given it to Richard Calloway. The revelation hit like a bomb. Suddenly, this wasn't a story about medical error or a bizarre coincidence. This was attempted murder, carefully planned and nearly perfectly executed. Someone had poisoned Richard Calloway with a substance specifically chosen to make him appear dead. Someone had counted on the doctors declaring him deceased. Someone had expected him to be embalmed and buried, where the toxin would wear off too late, where he would wake up 6 feet underground with no possibility of escape, where he would die in the worst way imaginable. And someone had almost gotten away with it. The police investigation shifted into high gear. Detective Reeves and her team descended on the hospital, interviewing every staff member who had contact with Richard Calloway. They questioned his family, his business partners, his friends, his golf partner Martin Hendricks. They seized his medical records, his financial records, his phone records. They turned his life inside out looking for motive, for opportunity, for the person who had tried to kill him in such a horrific way. And I became a key witness in a case that was quickly becoming national news. "Cleaning lady saves millionaire from being buried alive," the headlines screamed. Funeral horror. Man nearly buried in coma-like state. Hero worker prevents unthinkable tragedy. My face was on the news. My story was in the papers. And suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. Suddenly everyone wanted to talk to Maria, the 62-year-old cleaning lady who had heard what no one else heard, who had seen what no one else saw, who had refused to ignore the impossible truth right in front of her. But fame, if you can call it that, isn't what people think it is. It's not glamorous or exciting or fun. It's invasive and exhausting and sometimes downright scary. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, shoving microphones in my face every time I tried to leave. Strangers recognized me at the grocery store, wanting to hear the story firsthand, wanting to touch me like I was some kind of lucky charm. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deal offers, movie producers wanting to option my story. It was overwhelming, and I hated it. I just wanted to go back to being invisible, to cleaning floors and living my quiet life. But that wasn't possible anymore. The investigation consumed my days. I spent hours at the police station, going over my statement again and again, looking at photographs, answering questions I'd already answered a dozen times. Detective Reeves explained that my testimony would be crucial when they caught whoever had done this, that my willingness to speak up had not only saved a life, but potentially given them the evidence they needed to stop a murderer. So I cooperated, even though every minute of it was exhausting, even though I wanted nothing more than to go home and pretend none of this had ever happened. Rosa was worried about me. She called every day, sometimes multiple times, checking to make sure I was okay, offering to come stay with me, suggesting I hire a lawyer or a publicist or someone to help me navigate this sudden, unwanted spotlight. But I didn't want help. I didn't want to make this bigger than it already was. I just wanted the truth to come out, wanted justice for Richard Calloway, wanted to make sure that whoever had tried to kill him paid for what they'd done. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. The investigation revealed that Richard Calloway was not the beloved philanthropist his public image suggested. Behind the charitable donations and the society galas and the hospital wings bearing his name, there was a darker reality. His business dealings were questionable at best, criminal at worst. He had made his fortune through real estate development that had displaced hundreds of families, through investment schemes that had bankrupted small businesses, through political connections that allowed him to avoid consequences for his actions. He had enemies, lots of them, people who had lost everything because of his greed and ruthlessness. But he also had family, and that's where things got really complicated. Mrs. Calloway, it turned out, was having an affair, had been for years, with a man named David Chen, who worked as Richard's personal assistant. The two of them were planning to run away together, to start a new life with the fortune Mrs. Calloway would inherit upon her husband's death. But divorce wasn't an option because of Richard's prenuptial agreement, which left her with almost nothing if the marriage ended. Death, however, would make her a very wealthy widow with no strings attached. The evidence was damning. Phone records showed thousands of calls between Mrs. Calloway and David Chen. Financial records revealed that David had purchased tetrodotoxin from an online supplier 3 months before the incident, using a fake name and a disposable credit card. Security footage from the golf course showed David arriving just before Richard's round began, hanging around the clubhouse, having access to Richard's water bottle and his golf bag. The day they arrested Mrs. Calloway and David Chen was surreal. I watched it on the news like everyone else, saw them being led away in handcuffs, saw Mrs. Calloway's face crumble from its usual mask of elegance into something raw and desperate. She was screaming that it was a mistake, that she loved her husband, that she would never hurt him. But the evidence didn't lie. The police had built an airtight case and there was nowhere for her to run. No way to explain away the phone calls and the purchases and the affair and the motive that was as old as time itself. Greed and lust and the desire to start over without consequences. I felt strange watching it unfold. Part of me felt vindicated, felt that justice was being served. But another part of me felt sad, felt the weight of all the lives that had been destroyed by this one terrible choice. Mrs. Calloway would spend the rest of her life in prison. David Chen would do the same. And Richard Calloway, even though he had survived, would never be the same. The tetrodotoxin had caused permanent neurological damage. He would recover, the doctors said, but it would be a long process and he might never regain full function. He would live, but the life he had known was over. Everyone lost in this story. Everyone except maybe me, and even that felt uncertain. Was I really a winner here? I'd saved a life, yes, but I'd also become part of something much bigger and darker than I'd ever wanted to be part of. The trial was set for 6 months later, and I was called to testify. I dreaded it. Dreaded having to relive that morning in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Dreaded facing Mrs. Calloway and David Chen and having to look them in the eye while I explained how I'd ruined their plans. But when the day came, I found a strength I didn't know I had. I walked into that courtroom with my head high, wearing my best dress, my hair carefully styled, my hands steady. I was sworn in, I sat in the witness chair, and I told my story. I told them about hearing the sounds from the casket, about opening it, about finding Richard Calloway barely alive. I described his labored breathing, the grayish color of his skin, the terrible realization that he had been conscious in that casket, aware of what was happening to him, unable to move or cry out or save himself. The jury listened in absolute silence, their faces pale with horror. Mrs. Calloway wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, her lawyers whispering urgently in her ear. But David Chen looked right at me, and the hatred in his eyes was palpable. He blamed me, I realized. In his mind, I was the reason his plan had failed, the reason his dream of a new life with Mrs. Calloway had crumbled into dust. I was the obstacle he hadn't anticipated, the random variable that had destroyed his carefully constructed scheme. And maybe I was. Maybe I was exactly that. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and when it was over, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a handful of other charges I didn't fully understand. The judge sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and sobs. Justice, people said. Justice had been served. But justice is a complicated thing, I've learned. Richard Calloway survived, but he was changed. His family was destroyed. His reputation was in tatters, and he would spend years recovering from what had been done to him. Mrs. Calloway and David Chen would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, their dreams reduced to ashes. And me? I was back to being invisible again, mostly. The media moved on to other stories. The reporters stopped calling, the strangers stopped recognizing me at the grocery store. I went back to work at Serenity Funeral Home because Mr. Peterson begged me to come back, said he needed someone he could trust, someone with the courage to speak up when something wasn't right. I took the job, but it wasn't the same. How could it be? Every time I walked into a viewing room, every time I saw a casket, I thought about that morning. I thought about Richard Calloway trapped in the darkness, aware but unable to move, experiencing a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I thought about how close we came to never knowing the truth, to burying the evidence along with the victim, to letting Mrs. Calloway and David Chen get away with murder. And I thought about all the other times in my life when I'd heard something or seen something that didn't seem right, but I'd stayed quiet because it wasn't my place to speak up, because I was just the cleaning lady, and who was I to question what the important people were doing? How many times had my silence allowed injustice to flourish? How many truths had I witnessed but never shared because I was too afraid or too conditioned to believe my voice didn't matter? That's the real lesson of this story, I think. Not that I'm a hero or that I saved a life or that justice prevailed, although all of those things are true. The real lesson is that every voice matters, even the voices we've been taught to ignore. The cleaning lady, the receptionist, the janitor, the person behind the counter, the worker. You don't really see even when you're looking right at them. We all have eyes and ears and brains and instincts. We all observe things, notice things, understand things that the important people miss because they're too busy being important to pay attention to the details. And when we stay silent, when we convince ourselves that what we see doesn't matter because we don't matter, we become complicit in whatever happens next. I could have ignored those sounds from the casket. I could have told myself I was imagining things, walked away, finished my cleaning, and gone home. And Richard Calloway would have died in the most horrific way imaginable, and no one would ever have known the truth. His death would have been ruled a heart attack, his widow would have inherited his fortune, and David Chen would have gotten away with murder. All because I, the invisible cleaning lady, decided my observations didn't matter. But I didn't stay silent. And that decision, that moment of choosing to trust myself even when it seemed crazy, that changed everything. Not just for Richard Calloway, but for me too. I learned something about myself that day, something I wish I'd learned 40 years ago. I learned that I matter. My eyes matter. My ears matter. My voice matters. And when I choose to use that voice, when I choose to speak up even when it's uncomfortable or scary or likely to get me dismissed as a crazy old woman, I have the power to change lives, to prevent tragedies, to tip the scales toward justice instead of away from it. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. And I really need you to hear this, okay? You matter too. Whatever your job is, whatever your position in life, however invisible you might feel, you matter. Your observations matter. Your instincts matter. Your willingness to speak up when something doesn't seem right, that matters more than you can possibly imagine. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too small or too unimportant or too insignificant to make a difference. Don't let fear of looking stupid or causing trouble or being wrong stop you from trusting what you know to be true. Because somewhere, somehow, your willingness to speak up might be the only thing standing between an innocent person and disaster. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong but stayed quiet? Have you ever witnessed something that didn't sit right but convinced yourself it wasn't your place to say anything? Comment below and tell me about it. I want to hear your stories. I want to know I'm not alone in having learned this lesson the hard way. And I want to encourage you to promise yourself that next time you see something or hear something or know something that doesn't add up, you'll find the courage to speak up. You'll trust yourself. You'll use your voice. Because your voice matters. And it might just save a life. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own power to make a difference, please leave a like. It helps me know that sharing my experience, reliving that terrifying day, was worth it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply by trusting themselves and refusing to stay silent, please subscribe to I Live to Tell and hit that notification bell. Because I have more to share, more lessons I've learned in my 62 years of being the invisible person in the room. More stories about what happens when the invisible finally decide to be seen. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for making space for my voice. And thank you for remembering that every person you meet, even the ones you barely notice, might be carrying a story just as powerful as mine. See them, hear them. And when it matters, be willing to speak up for them or with them. That's how we change the world, one voice at a time. And it starts with you deciding that your voice matters. Because it does. It really, really does.